What I have with me today are two of some of the most capable off-road vehicles that you can buy. But they go about it in very, very different ways, and that's reflected in their price. When this G-Wagon was new, it came in at an MSRP of about $123,000. So we're gonna put it up against some of the best that America has to offer, the new Jeep Wrangler JL Rubicon, starting at, well, less than half that price. So thank you to Amato Jeep, Dodge, and Ram for making this video possible. Okay, so obviously there's a bunch of differences between these two vehicles, but we're going to start in the G-Wagon. Just like the Wrangler, this G-Wagon was originally intended as a military vehicle. It actually was first brought into civilian use in 1979. So back in 2019, it had its 40th birthday. And they celebrated that with a new generation, which actually is pretty special because they don't come out with new generations for this thing a lot. These are very low production vehicles, very exclusive, very high priced, and for that, they don't make a lot, so they don't update them a lot. So this is one of the late model years of 2017, when 2019 was the new generation. Now with its 41 years in existence, the Mercedes G-Class is actually I think it's the second longest running name and nameplate in the Mercedes-Benz lineup, aside from the Unimog, which coincidentally is also a military vehicle. You're kind of sensing a trend here. And for that purpose, the fact that it was originally built as a military go-anywhere vehicle, it does have real off-road chops, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But right now, what I want to talk about is ride. Pitch it into a corner. Oh my God, it's like driving a building. And then power out of it. So the biggest difference between this and the Wrangler is under the hood up there. Now the base engine here is a twin turbo 4-liter V8, makes 416 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. So it's a bit of a brute. Now it does send power from that engine through a 7-speed Mercedes-built gearbox. This is an automatic transmission. It is not the speed shift that you get in the AMG, but it is still a pretty good torque-converted Mercedes-built automatic transmission. From there, the drivetrain is a permanent 50-50 all-wheel drive system. So 50% torque is going up front, 50% is going to the back, and then from there you can control your differentials and things like that. But it's always 50% unless you've selected which axle you want to lock. So let's recap a little bit. We have a military-built and purpose-built off-road kind of not masculine, but kind of like a rah-rah, go anywhere, do anything kind of SUV. And then we've ritzed up the interior and we've stuffed a big V8 under there, put turbos on it, and making just a stupid amount of power and torque. What that results in is kind of a funny feeling little thing. The steering is pretty terrible. There's no directness at all. There's a bunch of deadness on center. I have no clue. It feels really lazy with what the front wheels are doing. A lot of that can do with some of the long travel suspension. In the corners, this thing is really narrow and it's really, really tall. I'm 6'2", and I have like 6 inches of room on top of my head, but I could reach out and touch the other side passenger door. So like the physics of it and the center of gravity is really high, and it just kind of translates to a really wonky and awkward feeling driving experience. And I don't mean like I'm testing this like a sports car, but there should at least be a little bit more that you can do aside from just tightening up the dampers with the sport setting. So we're in sport mode for the engine response, the gearbox, and we've got our dampers stiffened up. We're gonna send it into this corner here. Okay, so, I mean, sport mode does help a little bit. It still feels like a building, but rather than a skyscraper, it's just, I don't know, mid-height, mid-rise, I don't know, whatever you call them. I'm not an architecture person, but it still does feel kind of wonky. Now, I will say, it does not feel like a sports car, but you're not buying this for it to be a sports car. It's big, it's luxurious, it's powerful, it bellows. The sound in here is so good. It's not as snarly as the V8 and the AMG, but it still sounds really good. There we go. Yeah, right about 4,500 RPM is where you get nice sound. But anyway, enough of that. Let's get in the Jeep and see how it does. All right, we're behind the wheel of the Wrangler JL. Now, just like the G-Wagon, this Jeep got its history, its ancestry from the military. The original Willys Jeep served in World War II, just around the tail end, but it wasn't until 1986 that the Wrangler nameplate made its debut. So technically they haven't been making the Wrangler since 1986. However, a very strong argument could be made that the CJ from Willys is actually the first generation Wrangler, which they've been making since 1944. They made a 1944 to a 1986 run, and then in 86 it really became the Wrangler and it became what it is today. Now, since the mid-80s, when the Wrangler nameplate was established, there's been about 4 generations. There's been a YJ, a TJ, a JK, and now a JL. And obviously this thing came from a pretty rugged and rough past, being a military vehicle, but each generation has seen the Wrangler kind of come into its own in terms of actual driver's performance and refinement on the road, as we can see as I'm throwing it through a hairpin here. Well, a hairpin is on the street, but in any case, this JL actually makes leaps and bounds of improvements in actual on-tarmac performance and just refinement. You still get a little coarseness and strange sound from the engine. I just don't personally love the way that these engines sound, but you can actually take this thing on the highway without your roof coming off. But speaking of the roof flying off, we have to talk about the arguably best thing about the Wrangler, and it's the fact that everything comes off. You've got doors that come off, you've got a roof that comes off, you've got more doors that come off, and you have a windshield that can fold onto the hood. But let's get back to talking about the way that this thing drives. Now, Jeep has always been famous for their 3.6 liter Pentastar V6s. They're fairly bulletproof, but that's the base engine now. We're in the era of turbocharging, so what I actually have underneath my hood here is a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. Yeah, so it's not quite as powerful as the twin-turbo V8 that's under the hood of the G-Wagon, but I mean, it's just fine. Personally, like I said, I don't love the sound of it, but your fuel economy is going to reflect the smaller displacement in the engine, the turbochargers. It's going to be much more fuel efficient. Now, one of the things that I really like about the Wrangler is that you can still have it with a manual transmission. I have the automatic here today, but you can still get a 6-speed manual gearbox, which is a lot of fun. Now, the power from your engine will go through either your manual box or your automatic box, and then it'll go through a selectable all-wheel drive system. What that means, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is that unlike the G-Wagon, it's not totally electrically controlled. You have an actual lever here that normal Jeep owners will be used to experiencing. You've got 2 high, 4 high, neutral, and then a 4 low. So you can select your drive mode, or drive wheels, you can select your gearbox ratios, and you can select pretty much everything about it down here. So ultimately, impressions going directly from the G-Wagon to the Wrangler, it honestly is not terribly different. The biggest delta here is in build materials. So like, yeah, you get a little bit of like a a finished plastic, but it's not terribly scratchy. You've got a little bit of stitching up here with some padded leather. It's a nice cabin, I will not lie. It's a nice cabin for something that you can go out and get muddy and hose down. That's kind of the intent here. You should be able to hose down whatever it is with no problem and just let it air dry with your roof and things off. Now, I do actually kind of like the way that this is planted. You get a lot more understeer and a lot less performance out of these tires, these big knobby tires. But aside from that, it doesn't feel as tall and narrow as the G-Wagon does. And I think that's what's kind of speaking to me. It feels more planted despite not having adaptive dampers. So ultimately, I like it. And let's get to it. So as we start out with the G550, I think it's important to keep price in perspective because it is over double what the Wrangler is. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of the fine tuning and some of the upgraded things that they've done with this. Straight up from base, your base engine is a twin turbocharged 4-liter V8. We talked about power figures in the drive. It makes over 400 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. That's over double the torque of the base Pentastar V6 in that Jeep. And I mean, that directly translates to what you can do with hill crawling. You have so much torque available to you at a very low RPM, so you have a lot of control if you're going to be rock crawling and climbing. You also have a bunch of different drive modes to manage the delivery of that torque and that power. You have a low range gearbox, you've got hill descent control. But I think one of the biggest things that really compels people about the G-Class, and one thing that you don't really see on any other vehicle like this, is you have 3 locking diffs. So you have a front diff that locks, which essentially obviously means that your front wheels will spin in tandem, so one of them won't be completely spinning if it doesn't have traction. You have the same thing in the rear, and then you have a center locking diff. So all 4 wheels will rotate at the same speed. If you're, let's say, missing traction on your front left and your back right, you can lock all your hubs together, and you can do that with a 3 locking differential. Now, another thing that some of you might have thought about when you clicked on this video is you're like, oh man, this is a ripoff, this isn't a G63 AMG. And you're right, it's not. But I also went to the Mercedes plant out in Birmingham, Alabama, and I had some seat time in a G-Wagon in the forest with an instructor, and he talked about a lot of the new suspension components and the underbody things that are happening in the G550, which actually makes it a better off-road vehicle than a G63, and a lot of that has to do with some of the body paneling and some of the exhaust, because the G63 has that dual port exhaust under the rear passenger side door on either side, so that can scrape when you're crawling. Also, that has to do with your breakover angle. And speaking of angles, I mean, the G-Wagon has, I believe it's symmetrical, so it's 30 degrees approach angle and 30 degrees departure angle. I think you also get a 28-degree tilt, and I think you can ford just under 2 feet. I believe it's 23.6 inches that this thing can swim. So I mean, it's definitely got some off-road chops. This is not just a Kardashian cruiser down Beverly Hills. This thing will go off-road if you can afford to do that with this. But with that, let's talk about the Jeep. Now, where the G-Wagon does a lot electronically, the Wrangler is much more mechanical, which sounds kind of low tech, but at the same time, when you're off-roading, it's a lot about feel. And the more mechanical and personal input you can give, the less you have electronics taking over for you, the more confident and the better you'll do. I mean, you mechanically select your drive wheels, you mechanically select low range, you have a locking differential button, you have a front and rear axle lock, which is great, but it's just not quite the same level of control and sophistication that the G-Wagon brings. But again, that being said, that's a really sophisticated system that's in very, very few cars. I don't even know if a Range Rover has that. Now, the Rubicon that I have here is one of the more aggressive and higher kitted out, obviously, trims that you can get this. They've done a lot of things in the suspension and just the body to compose the chassis and deliver power and control braking and things like that. So when you are rock crawling, this is what you want to go for. They also make a Mojave, which is a little bit longer travel suspension, which is a little bit more for sand and dunes. This is more rocks, trails, and forest stuff. So with that, we should talk about approach and descent angles. So the approach angle on the front of this, I believe, is 44 degrees, which, think about it this way. So here's 0 degrees, here's 90 degrees, right in the middle is 45. So it's 1 degree less than that you can approach. So, I mean, if you've ever been at that degree or that level of incline, it's incredibly uncomfortable. Like, it's just not something you want to do. So the fact that this thing can do it is pretty amazing. Departure angle is about 37 degrees. So, I mean, again, fantastic capability there. This thing can wiggle itself up and down pretty much anything. And then in terms of water fording depth, this thing has about 30 inches, I want to say, which is about 6 or 7 inches more than the Mercedes. So this thing can go swimming if you really need it to. All this is basically, what the bro, no bullshit, there's like a gang of turkeys that's gonna try to kill me. They're gobbling at me. So all of this is basically to say the Mercedes might be more buttoned up, but you take both of these SUVs into a forest, it's the Jeep that's gonna be winching out the Mercedes. Wrangler wins off-road. Let's go on and talk about design. Now, from day one, the Wrangler has not been parading around as anything other than what it is. It's a badass, off-roading, you know, serious, capable SUV. It's not a crossover, it's body on frame, it's a very serious, purpose-built vehicle, and it's been advertised as such. But with that being said, there's been a lot of changes for this generation's JL. Up front, you've got the headlights that kind of spill into the 7-spoke grille. You've got LED running bars on the actual fenders. That's never been done before. You have kind of a gill sort of thing behind the front fenders. On the hood, you have scoops. And of course on the back, you have, you know, the LED lights as well. Those are updated. But you have a lot of stuff going on that's brand new to this generation, and it's kind of in line with bringing it into the more modern era, making it more comfortable, making it better on the road where 90-some% of this vehicle's life is going to be. And they've reflected that in some of the modern amenities that they've done in both the design and on the interior, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, of course, for the new JL generation, they updated some of the exterior stuff, but the interior is arguably even a more dramatic transformation. Of course, you get new gauge layout, you get a new steering wheel, you get a new head unit, new infotainment system, your dash, your shifter, it's all new. And that's great. One of the funny things that I always experience, because I don't drive Wranglers that often, I have a couple friends with them, but that's about it. But if you've never been in a Wrangler before, get prepared mentally and emotionally to sit about this far away from the windshield, because it's not like your normal car where you have about, I don't know, 1.5 feet of dash in front of you and then a very angled and sloped windshield. You have a very quote-unquote vertical windshield that's right in front of you. But one of the things that you'll notice at the bottom right hand of the windshield, you actually have little Easter eggs, and you have these all over these FCA products. So you'll find them all over the Jeep, but you have a little tiny Willys Jeep logo. The Willys is, of course, the original Jeep. We talked about that earlier. But you have a little Willys Jeep logo right in the bottom right-hand side of your windshield, which is really cool. Moving down from there, of course, you have your passenger side, your glove box, and then you, of course, have your detriment to everyone's knee. On your passenger side, you have that grab handle right on the dash, which I always slam my knee into in the old JK. I haven't done it in the JL, so that's good. It's a little bit more integrated into the dash. But of course, you got grab handles on the A-pillars as well. Now, fit and finish, of course, it is improved, but it's still an FCA product, so you get a lot of plastics. The synthetic leather is actually really nice. You get some rubberized materials and textures. You get some nice stitching, so it actually is quite nice. It's just not quite on the level that Mercedes is, but again, I wouldn't expect it to be for less than half the price starting. So, you know, you still get a lot of interior for your money, and with that being said, it's incredibly comfortable up there. The step-in is a bit higher than it is on the G-Wagon, but once you're in the seat, it's very comfortable. The back seats, I think, actually make up a huge difference between the G-Wagon and the Wrangler. There's a lot more room in the Wrangler's back seats than there is in the Mercedes. Trunk space is a little bit less than the G-Wagon, I think, but you do have a split opening tailgate. So you can open the lower portion that has the wheel on it, you can open that sideways, and then the top glass will kind of flip up. So you have, you know, kind of dual use there, which is always super nice. So while the Wrangler spent its history kind of, you know, making a name for itself as like the rough and tumble, adventurous, you know, kind of do whatever you want with me sort of vehicle, this G-Wagon has spent its 41 years at finishing school, and it's come out the other end as a very refined truck and not just kind of an off-roady adventure vehicle. And some of that really shows in some of the outside aesthetics. You know, you have this chrome bumper bar up front, you've got the LED lights, you've got the integrated fender flares, you have a fixed roof, the doors stay on, but there's a lot going on that kind of refine it, and they've done little tiny tweaks. They haven't done much to change the styling, but they've done little tiny tweaks here and there to kind of make sure it's still evolving with the times. Another place that you can really see your money go to work on this G-Wagon is in the interior, like I mentioned. So you have an interior that's just stuffed with some of the highest quality build materials. It is a Mercedes, it is German, and they've spared no expense with, you know, some of the G63s you get quilted leather, but you get really nice Designo leather seats here, heated and cooled, brushed aluminum on some of the switches, wood. There's just a lot going on to kind of firm up and kind of make the interior feel substantial and rich and kind of refined. And a lot of work has gone into that. Even the carpets are really nice in there. So that really does show. However, with that being said, there's about 3 years difference between these two vehicles here, the Jeep and the G550, and it really shows in the technology. So, well, whereas the Jeep is chock full of all of the latest modern stuff. I mean, even the backup camera is super high res on that Jeep, and it looks fantastic. You know, I have no complaints about the head unit over there, but in the Mercedes, it's very early 2000s. But another thing that I noticed in the G-Wagon, aside from my technology issues, is the fact that this looks like a really big vehicle from the outside, but when you actually get inside it, it's really narrow. You sit up really, really tall, but it's really, really narrow and really small. And the back seats, you have next to no room whatsoever. So you're definitely not getting a lot of friends in there, if any. And the trunk is decent size, but still, you lose a lot of practicality when you head behind those front seats. This is something that you can go out and have fun in and go adventuring and kind of rock around and not worry about it too much. I don't think people are really taking this off-road, which is a shame because it is still so capable. So while there's huge gaps between these two vehicles, I understand why this exists, and I really understand why this exists. And if it were my money, it's a pretty easy decision going this way. So in summary, if you're going to want to have fun with your vehicle, you want a little bit newer technology, you're going to want to go here. This is completely and totally a blast with the doors off, the roof off, the windshield down. I can not imagine how much fun this thing would be on like a long camping trip with some friends, going through trails and all that sort of stuff. That's what this truck is made to do, and that's where it's going to shine. And when you want to go home and have dinner downtown with your wife, you got the G-Wagon.